Let's begin with our first question. Just how patient is Jehovah? Well, God's patience is seen in his response to problems. For example, early in man's history, Satan boldly accused God of being a liar. The devil also challenged God's right to rule and also his way of ruling. God's response? Well, rather than becoming provoked, Jehovah exercised some 6,000 years of extraordinary patience so that the moral issues that were raised by Satan the devil could be resolved once and for all. Another example is in the time of Noah. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 6, it states that mankind's wickedness made God feel grief and sadness. But what was Jehovah's response to the wickedness? Well, instead of promptly becoming upset, Jehovah displayed his wealth of patience by tolerating the situation for 120 years. Later, God patiently tolerated the sins of the Israelites for some 1,500 years. In that and many other ways, God has shown that he is supremely rich in patience.
We've just been listening to Ramon Heinz, who is a Bethelite from the Warwick, New York world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses. He's delivering the final talk on the Friday morning with the theme, Treasure the Riches of God's Patience. And in this particular part of his talk, he's trying to make a convincing argument for God being a God of patience. In other words, wouldn't it be hypocritical if God were to demand that his followers be patient when he's not patient himself? There must be examples in the Bible of where God has been patient, and hey, here I found 3 of them for you. On another issue, I find his way of talking incredibly irritating and infuriating. It's almost as though he's trying to model his style of talking on that of Stephen Lett. He's kind of like a black Stephen Lett, isn't he? In just this really slow, cumbersome speech style that's laced with all of these kind of raised eyebrows and that sort of thing. Very, very irritating and distracting and infantilizing. And as I've said repeatedly, the infantilization has utility in making you feel like you're a child, making you feel like you're somehow dependent on the wisdom that's being given. But let's just focus now on those 3 examples of patience. The first example is, of course, the 6,000 years since Adam and Eve. 6,000 years of patience. God has been really, really patient in tolerating 6,000 years of humans suffering and dying and being in pain, all because his authority was questioned and Satan apparently lied about him. Yeah, thank you for that patience, oh Lord. What's interesting, and I've made this point before, but I think it bears repeating, is if you actually go to the verse in Genesis, you find the following to be very dishonest.
Early in man's history, Satan boldly accused God of being a liar.
Did he, though? Did Satan accuse God of being a liar? I've done this before. Let's do it again. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was the most cautious of all the wild animals of the field that Jehovah God had made. So it said to the woman, did God really say that you must not eat from every tree of the garden? That's a question. It's not a statement, it's a question. And you're entitled to ask a question without it being a lie. At this the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God has said about the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, you must not eat from it. No, you must not touch it, otherwise you will die. At this the serpent said to the woman, "You certainly will not die, for God knows that in the very day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and bad." So Satan is there saying, you're not going to die as a result of eating that fruit. Instead, your eyes will be opened and you will become like God, knowing good and bad. Then if you scroll down to the end of Genesis 3, let's pick up in verse 22. Jehovah God then said, "Here the man has become like one of us in knowing good and bad. Now in order that he may not put his hand out and take fruit also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." With that, Jehovah God expelled him from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he had been taken. So, actually, Satan was telling the truth. God didn't like the idea of Adam and Eve knowing good and bad and eating from the tree of life. In other words, having all of the things that he had, both the knowledge of good and bad and eternal life. So he expelled them from the Garden of Eden, which is after the conversation that Satan had with Eve. Satan wasn't to know exactly what conversation God was going to have and what decision he was going to make. So there actually wasn't a lie, and it's dishonest of Ramon Heinz to repeat this nonsense, that there was a lie to begin with. But even if there was a lie, even if Satan had lied about God, why do millennia of human beings need to suffer because someone's told a lie about God? Would be my question. Anyway, so example number 1, 6,000 years of patience since the Garden of Eden. Example number 2, 120 years of patience before God brought about the flood of Noah's day. Example number 3, 1,500 years of patience with the Israelites. So 6,000 years, 120 years, and 1,500 years. I want you to keep those spans of time in mind as we jump to later on in the exact same talk with the exact same speaker, because he's about to contradict himself.
Yes, God's patience is a precious gift. The riches of God's patience has allowed for millions of people the opportunity to come to know Jehovah and to reach out for the hope of salvation. And yet, if we're honest, rather than being a blessing, God's patience sometimes might appear to be disadvantageous. In fact, that leads us to our third key question. What might cause us to view God's patience as inconvenient, even detrimental? Well, when we or those who we know are experiencing intense suffering, we may wish for Jehovah God to flip a switch, to press a button, as it were, and bring the new world, and bring it now, Lord. In fact, that is why we're talking about this matter. When we find ourselves thinking that way, it may be that we have allowed an important fact to escape our notice. Well, what fact is that? Well, the Apostle Peter explains in the preceding verse. Do you note there at 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse number 8? Note what he tells us. However, do not let this escape your notice, beloved ones, that one day is with Jehovah as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Did you note that? This verse shows that Jehovah views 1,000 years as if it were a single day. Well, according to that way of figuring time, an 80-year-old person has only lived about 2 hours from Jehovah's standpoint. If you're 40, You've lived an hour, 20, 30 minutes, and you 10-year-olds, 15 minutes for you. Why is that? Well, the Bible says at Psalm 90 and verse 2 that Jehovah is from everlasting to everlasting. His life extends everlastingly into the past and into the future. Therefore, Jehovah has a truly unique view of time.
This is a truly unique example of Jehovah's Witnesses contradicting themselves in the same talk. I can't believe the audience was just laughing along with this and not spotting the glaring contradiction. This guy wants to have it both ways. Is he even trying at this point, would be my question. Is he even trying to make his talk make sense? I mean, granted, he's reading from an outline. These aren't his words. These are words that have been passed to him by the teaching committee. He's just talking mouth for the organization. But he's just gone to great lengths to argue for God being patient due to these immense spans of time, 6,000 years since Adam and Eve, 120 years before Noah's flood, 1,500 years with the Israelites, and now he's completely undone that reasoning from earlier in his talk by saying, well, let's remember that 1,000 years are like one day to God because God is eternal. So when it comes to your frustration with Armageddon not coming yet or seemingly delaying, let's just remember that God actually is being patient because 1,000 years are like one day. Well, by that logic, God clearly wasn't patient in these examples of extraordinary patience that you've just given us, because it's actually 6 days of patience since someone told a lie about God in Eden or challenged his authority. It's a few hours of patience in the case of Noah's flood, 120 years. And it's a day and a half of patience with the Israelites. You cannot have it both ways. And yet this guy, who again just doesn't even seem bothered about contemplating what he's saying and making sure everything matches up, everything squares up logically. This guy just wants to have it both ways. But that wasn't the only appalling reasoning in this talk. We were also treated to this nonsensical argument.
The riches of God's patience has allowed for millions of people the opportunity to come to know Jehovah and to reach out for the hope of salvation.
Anyone who's been a Jehovah's Witness for any amount of time has heard this argument again and again and again. It's not that God is delaying in bringing Armageddon. He's just allowing more time so that more people can learn the good news and become Jehovah's Witnesses, and therefore they'll get an opportunity to survive Armageddon. Kind of like when the door's coming down, the big slab of rock is coming down in Indiana Jones, and Indiana Jones just kind of manages to roll through at the last minute and grab his hat. You know, these people who we're preaching to have a few moments just at the end of this dying system where they get to survive thanks to the preaching work, which is only possible due to God's patience. That's the logic you buy into as a Jehovah's Witness. But it doesn't actually make sense when you look at the global population, which has just been ballooning over the last 100 years or so. Let's take, for example, the year 1914, which is supposedly when the last days began. The global population in 1914 was 1.7 billion. So we start off with 1.7 billion on our planet in 1914 at the beginning of the last days. Let's just pluck another date from thin air. 1975. What was the global population in 1975? 4 billion. Approximately 4 billion people were living on our planet in 1975, when Jehovah's Witnesses were predicting Armageddon to come, or at least hinting very, very strongly that 1975 would be a date of significance prophetically in the outworking of God's purposes for mankind. Fast forward to 2023, and the global population has ticked over 8 billion. So there is double the amount of people on our planet now than there was in 1975. So with every passing day, with every passing week, with every passing year, there are more and more people for Jehovah, the patient God, to slaughter at Armageddon.